Hello, and welcome to another episode of Legacy's Allure, brought to you by MTG Training Grounds, the educational series dedicated to providing you with all the info on popular decks, strategies, insight, and more for the Legacy format. I am your host, Zachary Cutt. This episode, we won't be talking about Magic. Well, that's not entirely true. Technically, it is Magic, using Magic cards and mechanics, but the deck we're about to showcase plays on an axis so far removed from traditional Magic that at times it's hard to figure out if your opponent maybe got confused and brought along a deck of Uno cards. That deck? Dredge. Joining us is a man with plenty of experience piloting this deck to tournament successes that include several wins and countless top 8s at top-level Legacy events in Southern California. Strong performance at 100-plus competitor SCG Premier IQs in the California area, and 2 Star City Game Open top 8s, one of which resulted in a win. He can be found on MTG The Source under the username Q, guiding new and veteran players alike through the complexities of the Dredge archetype. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Joseph Moreno. Joseph, welcome to Legacy's Allure.
Hey, thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. I'm glad you decided to join us. And like I said, we're going to be talking about Dredge, sort of the boogeyman of Legacy, or one of them, I guess.
Exactly.
So to kick things off, why don't you tell us what is Dredge, and let's talk about the mechanic and sort of the theory of the deck first, and then we'll go into some of the specific cards later. So kick it off.
Yeah, so Dredge was first introduced in 2005 in the Ravnica block, and it was attributed to the Golgari Guild. And basically what the mechanic says is that anytime you would draw a card, you can instead mill the top X cards of your library, where X is the number indicated after the Dredge keyword. Then you get to return this card from your graveyard back to your hand. And if otherwise, you would just draw that card as normal. So basically, anytime you could draw a card, you get to mill the top X cards of your library, like I said, and the number would be that indicated on the card. So if you're talking about like Golgari Grave Troll, that'd be your 6, Stinkweed 5, and the Thug would be 4. Mm-hmm. And then you return that card. And the one thing to note, though, it's because it's a replacement effect. It doesn't actually use the stack. So anytime, the moment you decide to use the Dredge ability to return the card to your hand, your opponent can no longer respond or quote-unquote in response exile that card from your graveyard, use a card like Extirpate and or Surgical Extraction. So that's also important.
Right, and like you mentioned, it's a replacement effect. So one of the really key, and we'll get into some of the specifics about how the deck works, but one of the key interactions there is that if you have multiple draws occurring in sequence, because they're all treated as individual events, you can actually dredge, mill cards from the top of your library, which would reveal more Dredge cards, and then dredge those as well. So you're not required to like take a draw. You can actually continue this Dredge chain, as they sometimes call it, putting a whole lot of cards into your graveyard. So
correct.
Let's go into the Legacy version of Dredge. What does the deck look like? What are some of the key spells, and why are they important to the deck?
So basically you have the core, which is the actual Dredge cards themselves, which are, if you're not familiar with them, it's Golgari Grave Troll, which is the one that'll dredge for 6 and is the most valuable because you're going to get to flip over the most cards. Mm-hmm. Then you have Stinkweed Imp, which is the dredge 5. Then the Golgari Thug, which is dredge 4. And they all have like small little niche abilities that sometimes you don't really pay attention to, but can be useful, and we can talk about those later. Mm-hmm. Then you have, of course, Bridge from Below, which is the cornerstone of the deck itself, which allows you to pump out all the zombies. We have Cabal Therapy also, which lets you sacrifice any creatures and then flash it back to let you generate a bunch of zombies while also at the same time getting to disrupt your opponent. You have Narcomoeba, Icarid, which are your recurable creatures, and that's pretty much the main core of the deck. And then, of course, you have your enablers or your draw discard. So you have your Careful Study, your Faithless Looting, Breakthrough, cards like Lion's Eye Diamond, and Putrid Imp. And then these numbers can vary sometimes. I'd like to think that like the main deck is pretty subjective, and as long as you know the key interactions in your deck, you can play around with some of the numbers. Then of course there's Dread Return, which some people eschew and don't bother even to play, but that's also if you're playing the very combo heavy version, what's one of the cards, one of the mainstay cards. And then, of course, you also round it off with the lands, which is just the rainbow lands, which you usually have 9 of to be able to cast most of your spells. And then Cephalid Coliseum, which acts as another looting effect, which allows you to draw 3 and discard 3 when you meet the threshold.
Right. So really the cards in the deck, they sort of fall into a couple different categories. You have, like you said, the primary dredge enablers, draw spells, which in conjunction with dredge enable, although, well, it's a little bit of both. They enable the dredge because they let you draw cards and you can replace those. They also all involve discarding cards, which sort of sets this whole chain of effects in motion by first getting the dredge cards out of your opening hand and into your graveyard. Like you said, you have the rainbow lands, cards like City of Brass or Mana Confluence or Gemstone Mine, things that produce it, because the deck needs about 3 different colors of mana at least, black, red, and green for the most part, and sometimes the sideboard will make it or require green then as well. And then the actual kill conditions, which is usually things like you said, like Icarid, Narcomoeba, and Bridge from Below to produce zombies. So those are sort of the pillars of the deck, and the interaction between all of these cards is very non-intuitive for someone who's never seen the deck in action, especially the legacy or vintage versions, where they can be very, very fast and quite confusing in a sense. So while we're on the topic of how confusing this deck is, how does it ultimately go about winning? And if you want to hit on some of the different variants, go ahead.
Yeah, no, usually, like because personally don't play a combo finish, which is usually, Dread Return into like a Grizzlebrand or Flamekin Zealot. So mine's like slightly more grindy. But normally, what you win with is Bridge from Below and generating these massive amount of an inordinate amount of zombies, and you just overwhelm your opponent. So, and usually Icrid allows you to do this for free because you're essentially bringing it back for free, exiling a black creature. But it has the effect where you have to sacrifice it at end of turn, so it itself lets you generate a whole army, and you don't even have to really cast any spells at some point, because just recurring Icrid every turn and letting it die and generating zombies is going to be good enough against most of the fair decks. So usually that, in conjunction with Cabal Therapy, allows you to basically strip any interaction your opponent has away from them, or it allows them to not build any momentum whatsoever. So basically you're amounting this great army, and you're taking away all their answers, and they cannot keep up because you're essentially drawing virtually 6, 5, and 4 cards to their 1.
Right, and in the intro there, I sort of implied that this deck was playing something other than Magic, and part of the reason for that is the only spells that you typically are casting by paying a mana cost are the draw spells, Careful Study, Faithless Looting, and Breakthrough. Everything else has like alternate ways of casting, or like in the case of Narcomoeba, you're not actually casting it. It's sort of like you get it for free as part of the deal of dredging it into your graveyard. So the deck is very resilient in some ways, because it doesn't, like a lot of decks in Legacy, rely on having mana sources to cast their key spells, and Dredge really only needs mana to get the chain started, and after that you don't actually have to have lands, which is convenient, because when you're dredging you never draw any more lands anyway.
Yeah, that's true. And like sometimes it's not unusual in game 1 where I may have an opening hand where I actually don't have any mana, and all I have is like a Lion's Eye Diamond and Faithless Looting and a couple of dredgers, and um, I'm confident that most game 1s, most decks can't deal with that anyway. So I have no qualms just dropping the LED, discarding my whole hand, flashing back the Faithless, and dredging like 12 cards on turn 1, because most of the time that's going to be good enough on turn 1, and then it's just going to keep snowballing from there. And they're not going to be able to keep up. And in that sense, I didn't even need any mana to essentially go off.
Right,
And
and
that's what's so
I
powerful about that as well.
yeah, I was gonna say I know Dredge definitely has the title of probably best game one win percentage of pretty much any deck in Legacy. It's got to be up
Absolutely.
there with some of the other like super aggressive combos like like Charbelcher or some of the faster Storm variants that you just like. Game one, most decks are not equipped to deal with a deck that's playing this bizarrely or this far from the norm. That said,
Yeah.
the post board games improve a lot, and we'll touch on some of the sideboard hate in a little bit. But before we get to that, you alluded to different variants, some of them which might recur things with Dread Return, such as Grizzlebrand, or I know I've seen some that use things like Elish Norn as a way to like
Yeah.
clean up a whole bunch of creatures and make your attack lethal in one hit. What would be the major? Like, what are the different variants? And I realize it's primarily just what their recursion target is. What are those variants, and why would you pick one over the other, or what is the purpose of the different variants of Dredge?
Well, if we're strictly talking about like LED dredge, because I still play Lion's Eye Diamond, but I don't play any dedicated targets. But if you're in a meta where it's going to be very fast combo like Storm, or even Sneak and Show because it's usually a turn faster, then I could see opting for the Grizzle brand or the Flare of the Haybound or Flamekin Zealot because you'll be a step faster, and in that type of metagame, that's probably what you really want.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want like the whole 4 Igrids. You might just want 2 or 3, and that's one variant of just the LED dredge itself. Then you have like Manaless Dredge also. I'm less familiar with that because now they're playing around with Prized Amalgam and all these other crazy recurve features, but that's also a different variant, and that actually I mean, it might play Dryad Arbor, I'm not even sure, but that one's just focused completely on bringing recurable threats. So they have like Nether Shadows, Icarid, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure they have. Yeah, and then the Narcomoebas, so they just snowball all the recurable creatures, and they actually play like 4 straight up Dread Returns as opposed to Lion's Eye Diamonds, which might only play like 1
Right.
for value, or like I said, 2 or 3 if they're playing the combo variant. So there's Manaless, then there's the European meta Quad Laser Dredge variant, which is just 4 of everything, and it doesn't play the Dread Return at all. So it's straight up stock 4 of everything.
Okay.
And I believe it was Timo Schunemann who first championed that list. I think he won the Grand Prix Ghent but he did that with Ant though. But he's, I think, the originator of that. And I don't know why it's not really popular here, but that's actually the list that I used to win to top 4 of the Star City Games Vegas back in 2012. It was just that 4 of everything. Then there's there's the Bloodghast variant too. So they play like Dakmor Salvage, and if actually that same tournament, there was another Dredge player that top 8'd with me as well, and he was playing the Bloodghast variant, and that's Jason Bolkowski. And if you look him up too, he's got plenty of like SCG success with his Bloodghast version as well. I'm less familiar with that one too, but that's also like one that seems he's had a lot of success with. So.
Actually, that's really interesting. I had never heard of a version running Bloodghast, but hey, that's why we do these interviews, right? You get the
Yeah, he
experts,
doesn't
and
play
they tell
Icarus at
us.
all. Yeah, he does not play Icarus. He's all in the Bloodghast package with Sun Titan and craziness, but it works for
Ooh.
him. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the benefits of Legacy is that if you're playing a deck that's less well known, the decks typically still have a pretty high ceiling for how powerful they are. But if your opponents aren't ready, then you sort of can get an advantage just by them not knowing what you're doing. Like they'll recognize it as a Dredge deck, but they may not realize how they're going to die or like what's coming next. And then before they know it, that like there's some whole new angle that got them, and they didn't even know they had a solution or had an out, and now it's too late, they're dead. So
Yeah, it's not unusual for my opponents to constantly read and then reread some of my cards to still fully try to understand what's really going on.
yeah, the Dredge deck's origins, all like you said, it came about with the Dredge mechanic in the original Ravnica block, but the deck really got its it's shot in the arm with Time Spiral block, because virtually all of the cards, it seems, that make the deck really tick come from outside of Icarid, basically come from Time Spiral and Future Sight. That they're really the sort of the building blocks for what the deck is and has been
Yeah.
for a long time.
That's actually true because yeah, when I like dredge all my cards, I like look at them and then you know they all have that future sight border, so it's pretty sweet.
All right, so let's talk about why you choose to play Dredge. It's obviously you're a big fan of it, so tell us what makes it appeal to you.
Yeah, well, it's just I still think it's like a very unfair combo deck at the heart of it, but it can really change gears because it's good against the creature decks because you usually mass many more 2/2s, so you can usually just attack right through them, and they're usually not much of a worry because I can chump block anything that they really throw. But then or like Delver decks or anything with heavy disruption, then I can just start to just dredge and not even really have to cast anything, and so its ability to change gears. It's also what's so good about it. You but more than anything, it's also just like an insane value deck. So like I was alluding to before, the fact that you can get like 4 zombies off of 1 creature dying is like really insane, and the fact that they can't do anything about it is even better. Especially like I said, game one, I think that's one of the hugest reasons to play it is because game one you're favored like very highly, and so basically you have to just do is win one of the last 2 games, and you're good.
Yeah, and that certainly is appealing about the deck, is that your game one win percentage is very, very high, and if you get game one as often, as once you're familiar and skilled with the deck, if you get game one as often as you theoretically should, that means that you only need one of those days where your opponents don't come prepped with quite enough graveyard hate or something like that, and then the whole tournament crumbles, under the weight of your combo because they just weren't ready for it. And I think that's one of those things that just like Burn in Modern, Dredge is and the graveyard based combo decks in Legacy, people, they respect them, but they usually, when they're looking for places to make cuts or places to skimp, that's where they start looking. They're like, well, who really plays Dredge anymore? And then you get paired up against that guy, and he just steamrolls you because, well, you cut all the rest in pieces, or you cut down to just one Grafdigger's Cage, and that's never enough. So
Right, yeah. And I always say that you should be able to, at least as a dredge player, you should at least be able to beat 1 piece of hate. So yeah, and if they're only running like 3, that means the odds are really in your favor. So
So you sort of alluded to this, but let's hit on some specifics. What decks is Dredge best against? And I realize you're going to have a good game one matchup against almost everything, but even after board, what are the matchups you really want to play? Like the ones that even post board they struggle.
um, that's most of the time, yeah. I would say like Delver decks, things like that, because the hate that they're bringing in is, I mean, usually you can kind of tell which decks are bringing in what type of hate,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's best against like I was saying aggro decks because most of the time their hate is it's more like artifact based hate, and you can kind of see it coming. And if it's like something like a relic or like a Tormod's Crypt, it's more easier to play around because you have to play around it more like a Wrath of God effect,
Mm-hmm.
where you'd have to try not to commit as much to the yard or get them to pop it early, or in an opportune situation, and then you can kind of take over with any like draw spells that you're sandbagging, and then try to go off again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has sort of that storm feel where, like, if you can hold back just enough, to fight against their hate, you can sort of force them to commit, and then when the first wave fails, then the second one is the one that gets them. And like I said, that's just how Storm does it. They'll, like, fire off a few spells, and when you blow your Force of Will, then, well, you just wait, and next turn you go at it again, and then they're out of resources type thing. So along those lines, then, decks are actually good against Dredge. Like what is a game one matchup you don't want to see, and especially like a game two and whatever. Like what decks are gonna give you trouble even game one.
Yeah, it's just usually that's just like faster combo decks like Belcher or Storm, Reanimator, and even like Sneak and Show sometimes can be a little bit faster because they can drop a Show and Tell in turn two, and depending on what the makeup of their hand is, that can be a pretty huge blowout. But I would say, yeah, those are the primary. But out of all of those, I would say that the worst is probably Reanimator because yeah, they my win percentage against them is not. I don't even know what. That's just one of the most horrendous matchups of all time.
Yeah, Reanimator seems to be one of those decks that's very polarizing. Like either you have a deck that can pretty well handle it, if you're playing something like Miracles where like all of your answers line up super well, or none of your answers line up very well when you're playing, you're playing something like Elves where like you can't interact whatsoever and they just blow you out. So,
Yeah.
um
Yeah, because that's a deck that even post board, unless you're running like Leyline of the Void, you're gonna just have a really rough time against them because they have like almost no problem finding that Electionorn, whether it be if they already have it, Careful Study into any reanimate spell gets there or Entomb, and you can do nothing about it because if you Cabal Therapy, they will Entomb in response and they will get you.
yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much a turn one or bust thing, and with Dredge, that seems like it's harder to do a turn one Cabal therapy than it is in other decks because of the restriction both on your mana and a lot of times you're trying to flash it back, so it's hard to have a creature. I
Yeah.
can certainly see it. Like Cabal therapy is obviously very powerful in the deck, but it's more of like a turn two, turn three spell as opposed to like turn one where a lot of like Storm and those kind of decks use it.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it all depends. Like, obviously, game depending on well how it goes down. If you're on the play and you already know they're playing Reanimator, then it's maybe a turn one therapy is not the worst because it's probably be the only time you get to hit like an Entomb or something like that. Or against Storm, it'd probably be the only. Or I guess Storm you'd try to hit like their Inferno Tutor. That's like the spicy card they got.
Right. All right, so let's talk sideboards. If most decks in the format have a really bad game one against Dredge, they must well either they hope to dodge it or they got to have something to sideboard. So what are the good sideboard cards to bring in against Dredge? What do people want as their hate for the deck?
Usually, so there's like different types of hate that there can be, and then there's artifact based hate, and you'll see that in the form of like Relic of Progenitus, Grafdigger's Cage, sometimes Tormod's Crypts, and even like Nihil Spell Bombs I've seen out of like Jund or Bug Delver.
Hmm.
Then you have your enchantments like Rest in Peace out of like Death and Taxes and your Blade decks. Then Leyline of the Void to kind of round it off for usually any deck that can't really cast it, I guess.
Hmm.
But you see those less popular choice, except for I guess like the Eldrazi decks that I've seen now play that or either I guess very macabre. Then you have like different types of creatures like Deathrite Shaman, Containment Priest, Scavenging Ooze. To a lesser extent, like Gaddock Teague, which shuts off like breakthroughs and Dread Return, and then I even consider something like Dahlia like hate, to be honest, because it makes it more difficult sometimes to cast any spells, and that's important because even out of your even if you're trying to cast spells for free, so like say your Cabal therapies, which are usually awesome, you can no longer cast, so you just become this really slow Dredge deck, and then your only way to get creatures is by having Ikarid come back, which is becomes a liability when they're packing plows. So
Yeah.
and then there's the spells, of course. So there's surgical extraction, and then less popular extirpate, which I'm glad nobody really plays because the split deck is actually pretty huge.
Yeah. Yeah, I think surgical extraction is definitely the more common of the two, and
Yeah,
I feel like some of those spells are obviously very 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 good. Like a card like Rest in Peace is absolutely devastating against a deck like Dredge. But some of them, a card like Surgical Extraction, I've heard a lot of Dredge players say that Surgical is far from the end of the world. Like it can be problematic or like a nuisance in some ways, but it definitely only interferes. It is not like the killing shot that some of the other ones can be like Grafdigger's Cage, for instance, is another really good one that like once that's out, it really shuts the deck down. So can you elaborate on why there is a difference? Like why surgical extraction isn't as good or extirpate in the same way that a card like Grafdigger's Cage or Rest in Peace or Tormod's Crypt is?
Yeah, I think that's mainly because the deck has way too many cards that you want to hit. So I mean, you want to hit Ikarit, you want to hit Bridge from Below, you want to hit some dredgers. So
Mm-hmm.
there's and then what if I'm playing Dread Return and targets like you want to hit like everything. So surgical is not very good when you're like trying to hit multiple things. So do you and then you're stuck in this situation where it's like, do I want a surgical now? Because what if he cabal therapies and then names that card?
Mm-hmm.
So now I have to just surgical whatever's in his graveyard when I can be sandbagging a different dread. Like if he targets a thug or something out of my yard, but then I can have a stinkweed at the ready. So he didn't really accomplish much there. And actually, recently at a Grand Prix trial, I had someone double surgical both my stinkweed and my Golgari Grave Troll, and then I had to rely on Golgari Thug, but that was still enough
Mm-hmm.
because I still had the draw spells to keep putting it back in my yard and keep dredging. And that was pretty much the reason why he kept the hand. He had Mulligan down pretty low already. So the fact that it's just too many cards that you want to hit, so it's less effective against than something like Rest in Peace and Cage, which just completely neuters the deck. One card, that's it.
So we now know what is good against Dredge, and I know for a fact Dredge has to plan for this kind of hate. So what does Dredge have to counteract its opponent's hate cards? Like what is your next level sideboarding?
Wow. So I mean, there's the as subjective as the main deck is, like I would say that also that the sideboard is also pretty subjective. I think it all depends on like preferential choices. Like for me, I have for those faster combo decks, I like to have Lotus Petals because they put you on parity game two, so I don't feel like even on the draw, I can still do like a turn one careful study and then drop Lotus Petal, crack it, and breakthrough on my turn one when I'm on the draw and still just blow out the Storm deck. So I think that's completely invaluable. Now, because even though you have that combo finish, I think that that's still slower than just being able to power out a turn quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then there's also cards like Ancient Grudge and Nature's Claim or Chain of Vapor to try to bounce those permanent cards and or destroy them. And then so there's this article by Richard Feldman called "The Dark Art of Dredge Fu," and in it he has this whole well, he would say the fearless approach. So what he was saying that using, or to quote him, he didn't know why he was boarding in these like terrible negative EV anti-hate countermeasures. So because he thought that too many things had to go right for something like Nature's Claim to really work, because for one, your opponent has to have the hate, then you have to have drawn the anti-hate,
Mm-hmm.
and so everything has to just work like the stars have to align perfectly where he's playing that, because there's been times where I kept the hand with Nature's Claim and they played just a regular game of Magic, and I would have probably been in a better advantageous position had that Nature's Claim just been like a breakthrough or a Lion's Eye Diamond. And I've actually lost games because I've had or I've dredged into cards that just don't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, I think there is merit to the whole fearless approach. I don't completely board nothing in for certain matchups, but there are times where I just don't bother to, because if I feel like you have to have like this pretty knowledgeable, at least know at least part of the metagame and know which variants are packing like those different types of hate cards that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that is kind of like also a big deal, because if you know they're playing Grafdigger's Cage but they're only playing like one or two copies, I may not bother boarding in like 4 or 5 cards to try to combat the 2 cards they may not, or one, they might not even see because the odds are not in their favor.
Right.
So I'm just going to go ahead and just not bother boarding in anything, or just something better.
Mm-hmm.
If I know it's like, obviously against a combo deck, I'm going to board in Petals and my Dread Return targets to combat them. But anything else against fair decks, sometimes I don't even bother to.
Right.
And that's his approach to it. So I think that also has merit.
No, and I completely agree with that in a lot of ways. I play Infect normally, and
Right on.
there's yeah, I like it. It's a fun deck, but there's a lot of times where I look at my sideboard and I consider, man, should I bring in these Crossing Grips? They might have something like a Knight of Souls Betrayal or some other like they might bring in Umazawa's Jite, like a card that I just can't deal with. And then I
Right.
stop myself and I think, why are you worrying about a 4 mana enchantment? Like you have Force of Will, Spell Pierce, and you can kill them on turn two. Some
Yeah.
games, like those things will answer it long or way better than a K grip would. So if you get into a situation where like they get to 4 or 5 mana, whatever it is, to play through a daze, and then they have the enchantment and they draw it and resolve it, whatever, you just lost. Like don't
Correct. And
don't
yeah.
dilute your deck just to maybe have a chance at beating some enchantment that they probably aren't playing anyway. Like you're just
Exactly. That's the exact line of thinking. Because yeah, and how many Knights of Souls Betrayer are they really packing? One, if
maybe.
if
Yeah.
anything.
So you're really your fear of the thing is worse than the actual potential of the thing. Like it's less likely to actually happen than you're making it out to be. Like you're afraid of nothing or something that's
Right.
not likely.
Yeah, you're diluting your deck with these cards that you're because you feel safe because you have them. But then, and in my experience, even when I do have these anti-hate cards like Nature's Claim, I have a very hard time resolving them because it turns on all their counter magic that I was not needing to really fight through
Right.
until they present the hate, and I got to try to answer it, and it won't resolve most of the time. So that's also another reason not to even bother and just continue to be the strong engine that you are.
Right.
um, but to also talk about the sideboard, I also have something like an Ashen Rider, because normally there's also these really niche like sideboard cards that sometimes get you, like Ensnaring Bridge, because you still need like the combat step to like get in there.
Hmm.
So something like that, or Glacial Chasm, or
Right.
Moat, even you see something like that, but you're really cold to cards like that, and having an out to something like those wonky cards is something that's really good, and it's better than the Angel of Despair would be, because it exiles permanents, so it doesn't destroy anything. So you don't get to lose your bridges if you want to exile a creature or something.
Yeah, and also like you said with Glacial Chasm, like a deck like lands can get it back normally, but if you exile it, there is no getting it back. So that's a pretty neat
Correct.
interaction that I hadn't even considered that. I always, in my mind, I always think Ashen Rider is for beating Show and Tell. But I guess if you can reanimate it, it can beat a whole bunch of other things too.
Yeah, and even actually against Show and Tell, sometimes they don't have the extra mana. So what they'll do is they'll Show and Tell in their Sneak Attack enchantment and then let it sit there. Because I mean, the odds are really with them. Like most likely they're gonna top deck a fatty and or brainstorm into a fatty, so they're cool with that. But I've gotten into a situation where they've done that, and then on my turn I got to Dread Return the Ashen Rider and exiled their Sneak Attack, and so that's pretty good too.
Right back to square one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Then I also have something that I added recently back in. It was like Blazing Archon, because it's against like the Eldrazi decks. They really have no answer to that, and also for Sneak and Show again. So the only way they can get rid of it would be if they have like the Wipe Away or Echoing Truth or something.
Yeah. And they probably are less likely to have that in against Dredge because why would you expect something like that? So,
Right.
yeah, you may just stone cold them then.
Yeah, they might for zombie tokens, but that's pretty unusual normally.
Right. So, why would you recommend Dredge to a new Legacy player? Like, what type of player do you recommend it to? And when you're trying to convince them to give it a spin, what are you gonna say? What would be your justification for someone playing Dredge?
Wow. I mean, I think it's a very strong deck. It's just I think that I like to play it also because there's some level of little flair that you get with it, because like it does play unusual. It's like unlike anything else. So normally when I'm flipping over all these cards, people come over and they're like wondering what's really going on, or they're wondering why is there like this giant pile of cards in front of me. So that's also pretty cool, because in Magic, I think it's pretty sometimes you just get caught up in like the whole just kind of mundane. You're all playing the same type of deck, so I like the one Dredge player in the room, which is usually the case. And so I think that's also why it draws me to it, because it's kind of like that. What would you call it? Like a fringe. It's still a fringe deck,
Hmm.
so I think that it's also one of the reasons I like to play it. But if I was recommending it to anybody, it'd be because it has a strong game one, and you really the odds I think are. I mean, I think you're really favored against most decks outside of, say, yeah, like Reanimator or Belcher. To be honest, because even a matchup like Storm is, if they don't kill you, yeah, like on turn two or three, I mean, you should be able to have disrupted their hand and or done something to stop them. So that's completely a huge loss there. So I just think you're heavily favored in most matchups.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a couple other appealing things I've noticed too. Like Dredge is one of the less expensive decks in Legacy, so it's a little easier to get into if you're new. So I know that appeals to a lot of the newer players. Also, it does sort of have sort of that mystique to it, right? It's like it's a deck that it really came all at once out of one set. It just was like this thing that all of a sudden happened, and it has the history of just like being the boogeyman. Like people when they find out you're on Dredge, they'll usually groan because oh, you're that guy. But at the same
Yeah,
time, they're scared because like they aren't ready for it. They know they're like 90% or greater to lose the game one or whatever. So like they're immediately put on edge, and in some cases they'll be put on tilt because like
yeah,
they're now down a game against a match they don't want to play against, a match they typically don't respect enough, and that's going to give you a huge edge. I think I actually personally think I've never played Dredge, but I played against it plenty of times. If you're a good Dredge pilot, like a very skilled Dredge pilot, you probably have a huge advantage on a lot of people because they don't get enough practice against it to begin with, and um, like I said, you just don't get enough. They don't respect the deck enough to put in the time to figure out like how it works and what they should like what the intricate lines are. That like if you're very good at your game, you're gonna get wins that you probably don't even deserve because like
yeah,
they're just not ready for it. Like you're catching them with their pants down and you're just gonna win because of that. So I think that's pretty awesome. Now
yeah.
that
I think that's very true.
and now that said, well, I'll let you explain, but I feel like the difference between a novice dredge player and a very skilled, like high level dredge player is very noticeable. I think the skill barrier to getting good with that deck is much higher than people give it credit. So why don't you elaborate a little? Say like, well, first of all, do you agree that there's a pretty big skill barrier to getting good with the deck, or getting mastering it, and then what are some of those like intricate, excuse me, tricks that people don't notice that sort of make you a master player versus a novice?
Yeah, no, I think it's because it plays unlike any other deck, is that most people might have at first a tough time getting used to that, because obviously some of my friends have just messed around and then tried it out, but then they're like drawing cards when they're supposed to dredge or something like that. So it's just like non-intuitive. But I think, I mean, if you have a basic understanding of like just Magic the Gathering, I think you're fine. But more importantly is just knowing all of the triggers that are involved in the deck, because there are so many, between Narcomoeba, the Bridge from Below triggers, and stacking them correctly, Icarid, even when to activate, maybe like Cephala Coliseum, like Lion's Eye Diamond, things like that. It's just a lot of like small little intricacies, but I think after you go, if you goldfish it a little bit, then that's a start, and then to getting to know, to familiarize yourself with it and the triggers. So I think that's pretty important. Um,
Yeah, you hit on a lot of the key points there. Like you need to learn all of your triggers. A lot of the cards do not play intuitively. One thing I didn't realize when I first saw someone playing Dredge is when you actually dredge, like say you dredge a Golgari Grave Patrol back to your hand, you're gonna mill the top six cards of your library into your graveyard, but they all go at the same time. So those six cards, you can actually rearrange them. They don't have to stay in the order that they came off the top of your deck. So if you're playing with cards that want to know the order of your graveyard, for instance, you get to specify what order they go to the graveyard. That's especially important, I know, with Manaless Dredge, where you want to put Nether Spirit on the very bottom because it needs creatures above it in the graveyard in the ordering of the graveyard. And I'm sure there's other cases I'm forgetting, but those kind of things really matter. Like you said with Lion's Eye Diamond, that one's another very bizarre card to work with because it produces mana, but you can't ever use that mana to cast any of the spells that are in your hand, because of the way the timing works. And I realize that one's a little more common because it's played in Storm and stuff too, but it's another thing you have to
Right.
realize. Like you can't cast Careful Study with Lion's Eye Diamond. You can only cast things like Faithless Looting with its flashback or something like that. So or activate your Cephalid Coliseum, think really bizarre things like that. So think those kind of interactions are important to learn, and that probably is the big or part of the big skill gap between a good dredge player and sort of a novice.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like just knowing when you get to like go all in as well sometimes because usually like if I'm leading with say like a Lion's Eye Diamond, I'm trying to actually bait like a counter spell because what I really want to resolve is the Careful Study. I think like Lion's Eye Diamond is a lot more volatile because you have to discard your whole hand.
Hmm.
So usually I'll lead with that and try to see if they'll just go ahead and force will that. And I think it's like one of those like scary cards that they see, so they have to like almost like instantly react to it. And I
Hmm.
think that's like one of those small little tricks. Also, something like at your upkeep when Icarus triggers, like if you have black creatures in your graveyard that are dredgers, but you don't want to exile those to the Icarus, you have an active Cephalid Coliseum, you can like crack the Coliseum in response to the Icarus trigger to try to use those dredgers to try to mill into like say putrid imps or like additional black creatures to exile that are not going to be your dredgers. So that's also something small. Using like Golgari Thug's ability sometimes is kind of beneficial. Like if you have the 2 mana like permanent lands, like Mana Confluence or City of Brass, then you can get into a situation where you can dredge 4, cast it, and then use it as like a chump blocker or what have you, generate zombies, and then use its ability that says whenever it dies, you get to put any creature from your graveyard on top of your library. So then you can recycle any Narcomoebas that have gone into the graveyard previously and put it back on top of your deck.
Yeah, see,
And so
that's
next turn,
perfect.
yeah, so the next turn you can dredge 4 again, hit the Narcomoeba, then recast the Thug, and then just keep doing this. Then just keep doing that over and over again. So that's gotten to be pretty good too.
Yeah, that's like the grind mode, right? You get like
Yeah,
three
exactly.
Narcomoebas and Golgari Thugs. What more could you ask for?
Exactly. So it's not unusual to cast like a Thug or a Narcomoeba because sometimes you need them later to flashback, say, a Cabal Therapy or Dread Return.
Hmm.
So yeah, or just blocking because eventually you're gonna dredge into those bridges. So
Right. Yeah, now Bridge, that's one of the most important cards in the deck because it, like you alluded to earlier, it's what makes your armies of zombies. And I think Bridge from Below is probably one of the most or least understood cards. It's the most misunderstood card in the deck, and that's usually not on the Dredge player's side. It's your opponents who don't know what Bridge does or how to interact with it. I actually just did an interview with Rudy Brixa where he pointed out one of the really like it it seems intuitive when you understand it. The whole exiling your opponent's bridges by killing your own creatures, but it's very
right.
non-intuitive until you've seen it done.
Right. I forgot to mention those things because like my opponents have gotten really creative with things like that. So like what I've seen is someone get like Batter Skull with Stoneforge Mystic, then return that back to their hand, and then the germ token dies, and then my bridges get exiled. So
Hmm.
there's that. There's Curse Catcher, which is the obvious one. Once that guy hits play, it's like almost impossible to cast anything because he's just going to sacrifice it and get rid of all your bridges.
Hmm.
Uh, they've abrupt decayed their own creatures before, lightning bolted their own creatures before, they've wastelanded their own Dryad Arbor, just absolutely anything.
I was gonna say I know one. This is a really really bizarre one, but one time I um, attacked with a noble hierarch and berserked it so that it would die at the end of combat and get rid of some bridges. I,
That works.
I didn't actually have the infector to kill him, so I needed a way to get rid of a few bridges and buy myself a few turns. So I thought, well, what the hell? I'll just
There
kill
you
this
go.
hierarch off,
Whatever works,
whatever it
man.
takes. Well, So we've got some good stories here about how to destroy bridges. Why don't you tell us a story about when you were playing Dredge, something really awesome, like one of those best of moments where you were on top of your game, and describe like what happened and how it ended up.
Well, I mean, I just think, well, nothing really completely like just sticks out. I mean, obviously, there's just like these funny situations you get into sometimes where, like, against like Sneak and Show, they've show and tell, and then so they reveal Grizzlebrand, and then I drop Golgari Grave Troll, and then it's like a 16-16, and then I'm like, okay, my turn, attack for 16, and then they have to use their Grizzlebrand to chump block or Emrakul to chump block. So stuff like that's pretty hilarious. Or against that same deck, I've gotten to a point where Sam has like 17 life, and he swings with Emrakul, but I've like a few actual creatures out, like a few Narcomoebas maybe, and as long as I have like a few bridge from belows, he annihilated my board. Then for each Narcomoeba that died, I generated like 4 zombies apiece, and then on my turn I recurred Icarid and then killed him with a bunch of zombies and Icarid. So there's that. But I think just like basically I think the SEG Oakland win is pretty much the one that stands out the most, because that day I felt like that deck was pretty much like unbeatable, because even the one match that I lost in the Swiss, I felt was due to like a punt on my part, but I just yeah, I was winning games even against like Thin Fins, which is really even just a way faster than even faster than Reanimator. And then in top 8, I beat Sneak and Show in round 1 even, which is, like I said, usually like a kind of tough matchup. And then Glenn Jones with the Blue Red Delver, which at that time was insane because I was playing Treasure Cruise. So that was also one of the crazy cards at that time. So I think that was kind of one of my favorite moments. And then all my friends were there, and then we all were chilling after. So I think that's kind of stands out as the most greatest thing I've done with the deck itself, and then repping the West Coast. I think SCG needs to come out here more, because I think like I don't get to play in as many high, those 100+ tournaments, because they're not coming out here anymore.
Yeah, no, that is unfortunate that they really stick to the East Coast more. And actually, where I live in Alabama, and we don't even see them down this far south very often. A lot of times I've got to travel, for me it's like 4 or 5 hours. For you it would be a 4 or 5 hour plane ride. So I can definitely sympathize. Like it's never as close as you want, but at least you get the opportunities to play some, and like I said, you've had some good results to show for it. I'm still working on the open win, so I'll keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely did not expect that. That was like, yeah, that's another reason why it was like so awesome. And then we ran the no splits, so then it was awesome for me. So not on my end, but still, that was pretty cool.
Well, while we're on the topic of legacy tournaments, we have a set coming out in about a month, Eternal Masters, which is supposedly going to be filled with cards that are staples, or at least see some play in the Eternal formats, Legacy, Vintage, and I suppose Commander to some extent. And anyway, I think that's going to be the topic on everyone's mind probably for the next month. So I just wanted to get your opinion and your thoughts on it. What do you expect to see in Eternal Masters, and what should other Legacy players look for? And also, what impact will that set have on the Eternal formats?
Well, I mean, I think I don't know really too much about it, or what, like, because I'm not much of a speculator also, so I feel like I think that's kind of the biggest draw to most of the rumor mill and things like that. But I just think that if it overall gets more people to play Legacy, then I'm all for that. Whether that means reprints, or it means your cards go down in value, I'm not gonna care. As long as there's more people playing the format, then that's awesome. And I think that's kind of what I'm most interested. And then Commander's always fun, so any cards that float around for that's always gonna be pretty sweet.
No, I'm the same way. I mean, I want to see big name reprints, because I don't care about the value of my. I mean, obviously, I don't want my like Tarmogoyfs to become $4 cards. But if that's what it took to get people interested in Legacy, I would just bite the bullet and go with it, because I think the same thing. I just, whatever it takes to get people more interested in it, and to promote it, yeah, I'm totally in favor of. And I hope you're right. I hope they do really push it and get people interested in the format. I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, because the entry to barrier is pretty tough already. I mean, like most people have to spend like 2 to 3K like on the mana base alone. So, and it's not like I don't own those cards either. Like that's why it's like another thing that most people think that when you're playing something like Dredge, it's because it's kind of just like yeah, like the cheap alternative. But you know, really, it's just like again, like I just play it because it's just like has this inherent advantage over most decks. So it doesn't really matter what you're playing, and that's why I try not to take any of my opponents or take them lightly because yeah, you never know what to expect, especially in a format like Legacy.
Yeah, that's what makes it so great. Well, Joseph, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. Your passion and your dedication to Dredge is inspiring. Thanks for giving us some of your time and for explaining one of Magic's most bizarre archetypes.
For sure, man. Thank you for having me on the show, man.
No problem. And thank you to all of our listeners and our viewers. It has been my pleasure to bring you this episode of Legacies Allure. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and feel free to leave us feedback on our YouTube page. Or you can message me directly at mtgtraininggrounds@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook at the user mtgtraininggrounds and follow us on Twitter at @mtg_trgrounds. I'm your host, Zachary Cuck. Thank you for joining us.
Peace.